Hello, and welcome to How to Optimize B2B Payments for Your Business. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Heather Rowney. I'm Marketing Director of the Controllers Council. Before I do get into our excellent panels that we have for you today, I do want to share just some brief housekeeping items. We will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to use your GoToWebinar control panel to ask our expert any questions. You can ask them now if you prefer, but we will answer those at the end. Next, I also wanted to remind you that this webinar is CPE eligible. So we will have 3 polling questions. So again, please use your GoToWebinar control panel to answer each poll. And we will be the Controllers Council will be sending out those CPE certifications within 1 week of this event, so please look for that as well. One more thing to mention regarding your CPE, we will also have a brief survey that will launch directly after this webinar, so please complete that as well. Finally, I did want to mention you will receive a link to this webcast via email within 24 hours, so no need to take any screenshots or take copious notes. You will get a copy of this presentation. So now just a quick word about our partner and sponsor, who is Bill, which is a leader in financial automation software for small and mid-sized businesses. And you can certainly learn more about them at www.bills.com. So now let's jump into our panelists. I am pleased to introduce these expert panelists. First up, we have Angus McLaren. He is the Director of Product Marketing at Bill. He has an MBA from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BA from Harvard University. Joe Fleischer is also with us. He is Webinar Content Marketing Manager for Bill, who has more than 16 years experience, including CFO.com and Argyle. So with that, gentlemen, welcome, and Joe, you can take it away.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very excited to discuss B2B payments, and in particular, how organizations can have the opportunity to optimize B2B payments. So, among the topics we're going to discuss before we begin our conversation with Angus, among the topics we're going to cover are how to develop a comprehensive payment strategy. That's the overarching topic. We're also going to talk about some key aspects of this strategy, including cost, speed, and risk, among other considerations. We're also going to talk about payment methods, what payment methods make sense in different scenarios, how to work with those that you're paying to determine which payment options to use. And then finally, we're going to talk about, and actually throughout this webinar, frankly, I list this last, but we will address this throughout our webinar, automation, the role of automation in streamlining payments, and that encompasses approval, not just the payments, but also approval and reconciliation. And by the way, we are not going to necessarily limit ourselves to payables. We'll also talk about receivables. So I'm so glad, Angus, that you're joining us today. And I'd like to launch into our first question. And the first question that I want to pose to you, Angus, is, in your observation, what would you say are the most prevalent payment options that small and mid-sized businesses currently use when paying vendors and or suppliers?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So one of the things to just start with is, checks are still one of the primary ways. Looking at stats from even the last couple of years, we have 90% of businesses that are still using check. So this, even for us, the largest number of actual payments are still being made by check. And it's honestly, it's a tough habit to break. I'm guilty of this. If a landscaper comes by, it's easy to just write out a paper check. And so just given the amount of businesses that are starting with that, you're still seeing that be one of the big ones. That said, you're seeing ACH grow a lot over the last 5 years. Part of this was just things like COVID and having more distributed teams. You can't necessarily have approvals and easily be able to sign checks if the person who's doing the signature and the person who's sending out the check are in different places. So you're definitely seeing a lot more of that shift. And then, well, I made the comment earlier about how checks are still the number one kind of number of payments, in terms of actual payment volume, it's not even close. ACH is much higher. I've seen even examples of it being about 4 times as much in terms of payment volume or going through ACH. So you're seeing definitely a shift as, checks are still there, but a rapid rise around ACH. And then also, you're seeing a rise around kind of credit card. It's not to the same level per se, and part of this is just, you still have less than 50% of businesses that accept cards. So while credit cards are great on one side from the AP side, if you can get float, make payments later, you have rewards, but you also see some limitations around this. One is this may not be integrated into your AP solution, and so you've got some payments going out through credit card and then some payments going out through either check or ACH, and so being able to actually see all those in one place is one challenge. And then the comment, but are vendors actually wanting to be paid by credit card? And that is, it's having to pay the 3% fee. This may not be part of their business model. There are scenarios where they do want that, and we'll get into some of these later, but things like card on file, which ensures kind of guaranteed payment on a monthly basis, those can be scenarios where they do want that. So you kind of see on that last part with credit cards, there's a little more clear positives and negatives on it. So I do want to flag a couple of other payment options that are there. So it's, we are seeing, wire transfers, P2P, things like PayPal and wallet to wallet type transfers. That part is growing, that last part specifically around kind of P2P. Wire transfers, what I'd say is on a domestic level, we see a lot less of that. For international, it is the primary way. So if you have an international vendor, that is a significant piece. So that's some of the basic things that we're seeing around that. The one kind of other thing that I want to highlight about this is as payments have gone more digital and kind of towards e-payments, there's the opportunity to break out the funding method and the disbursement method. So check is one thing. You pay by check, it's deposited by check. But as you start to be able to have more of this digital flow and it going through AP providers, you can fund with ACH, and then a disbursement method can be something different. So we see 2 or 3 of these examples on our side. So one of which is something like virtual card, where something can be funded by ACH and it can go out as a virtual card on the other side. Or a feature that we launched recently called Pay by Card, where if the vendor doesn't accept card, you can pay through bill via card, costs 2.9% fee, but then we send it out as an ACH to the vendor. And so it's important to realize that, this is a big change where we can start to rethink what the funding method is and what the disbursement method is. And it allows a lot more flexibility for companies when they're talking about AP.
Well, thank you very much, Angus. I know we have some evidence here to support a lot of what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, and you see this, it's, checks is still the highest one here, but you see ACH very close to it. I talked about the wire one being kind of more around international. I've seen a number of stats also, the prevalence of companies having at least one kind of international vendor. So that doesn't surprise me that one's even higher than card. But you really start to see those kind of top 4 are some of the ones that we talked about earlier. And yes, you've got kind of real-time payments, which in this survey is the presumption is this is what is around, kind of the Venmos, the PayPals, and those examples there. And virtual card is there as well. So this kind of highlights back why you're seeing those top 4 and why you're seeing some of those top 4.
Thank you, Angus, for elucidating these findings. I do want to point out the total will exceed 100% because presumably those who responded to the survey could choose more than one, including wire. Now, one thing I want to ask you about, Angus, before we start our first polling question is you alluded to virtual cards. And you did provide a distinction, but I think just for the benefit of our audience, can you further clarify the distinction between virtual and credit cards?
And that's a bit of a complicated one in some senses because different companies define it as differently. You on a consumer side, you can have the regular card, it's a Chase card or a Capital One card, and then here's the virtual version of it that I'm using. how we normally are defining virtual card, and especially for Bill, is it's a single-use card that is sent out. And the big piece around this is often when you think of the traditional card, here's the specific number. When you start to be able to offer this virtually, then you can provide separate card numbers depending on who the customer is, or a one-by-one, which does have an impact on kind of fraud and security risks. So there is a benefit around some of these virtual cards. And so that's one of the reasons why you start to see some of the differences between those two.
Very, very helpful. And we'll certainly be talking more about virtual cards in just a bit. But before we